Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf lamed tet. This week's learning is sponsored by Mark Goldstein for a full shlema of Ben Ezra Septi Ben Rina and Aliza Margalit Bat Shena Raya. Today's daf is sponsored by Aviva Appelman in loving memory of her mother, Florence Appelman's second yahrzeit. We're going to get started today. I'm going to do a review of the very end of yesterday's daf, and we'll kind of set us up for what we're going to do today. Kind of, always at the end of the daf we're a little bit rushing, and now we'll be able to take some perspective and learn that well. So we started with this issue of dealt with the first part of the Mishna, the chata'ot chitzoniyot, the ones that the blood is brought on the outer altar, the regular sin offerings. Beit Shammai holds one nitina, Beit Hillel holds two. Beit Hillel holds one, Beit Shammai holds two. We're really dealing with Beit Hillel's shita of one. That leaves three that are not as critical, because once the first one's done, right, we already learned in the Mishnah, there's no pigul in the other ones because the main atonement is already done. It's not a critical part. And what we saw yesterday was this Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Papa who set up this distinction, right? Rabbi Yochanan mentioned three halachot, where two are like the original placing of the blood, the first one, and in one way it's totally different. And Rav Papa set up 8 ways in which they're similar to the other bloods, and 4 ways in which it's different. And we're now focusing in, zooming in on one. One of the things that Rav Papa said, we're going to treat these, right, you can see why these 3 are different, because the atonement's already been done. On the other hand, it's still placing, like, ideally you're supposed to do all 4. So in a lot of ways they're going to be similar, but in a few ways they're different. So one of the ways they're similar is kibus. Kibus is this din, again, you can read Shuli Mishkan's article. She deals a little bit about the kibus law in the Mikdash, which she does very interestingly, is talks about laundry in general in the time of the Gemara, and mentions of laundering in the Gemara and the Mishna, and it's just interesting. So, right, Shuli's always kind of into the whole purpose of flashback is to have an idea of the reality of their time, and yes, and she also talks about laundry in Chol Moed. Anyway, it's an interesting article. But what I want to talk about here is this law of kibus in the Mikdash. What it's really saying is that there's blood that's sanctified, and because it's sanctified, the laws of dealing with it, once it gets on your clothes, it's not like generally washing something out that you just wash it out and get rid of it, but you have to treat it in a certain way of sanctity because the blood is sanctified. Now the question is, at what stage is this law kick in? And until what stage? So we quoted this Mishnah, and soon I'll explain why we quoted this Mishnah, but we quoted this Mishnah. I just want to talk about kibus outside for a minute. It's the Mishnah daf tzadi gimel in Zevachim, so we'll get to it at some point, in a while, but we will get there. The Mishnah talks about when the blood comes out of the animal's neck, before what? Before it's sanctified. It didn't go into the sanctified vessel yet, the kli sharei. We didn't do the Kabbalah, right? It just splattered out. That's not sanctified blood, because the blood becomes sanctified when it goes into the kli sharei. So that's why it doesn't need kibus. Likewise, when we get to a later stage where the blood's already been put on the altar, so also it doesn't have sanctity anymore, so it doesn't need this law of kibus that it has to be, what it really means is it has to be washed out in the Azara. You can't take that blood out and wash it out somewhere else, because it has to be treated with it. We obviously want to get it out, but in the end it has to get it out in a particular way. So that's the law of kibus. So now the question becomes, now you understand the question very well. If it's only blood that needs to go on the altar, well, the 3 matanot don't really need to go on the altar. They do and they don't, and that's exactly the tricky part here. They don't really need to go because you already got atonement from the first one. On the other hand, it's a mitzvah to do it, and it's part of the critical elements, right? We still put that into zrika, and that's what Rav Papa comes and says, they need kibus. Okay? And then he proves it from the following Mishnah. So now let's go back to that Mishnah. The Mishnah daf tzadi gimel says, if it goes from the tzavar labeged, it doesn't need kibus. Okay, that we already did. Now it says, min hakeren umin hayesod eno ta'un kibus. If it's blood that's already gone on the keren, or already gone on the yesod, it comes from there, the mitzvah's already been done. So if it gets on you, you put the blood on that, and it splatters off on you, or you rub against the mizbeach or something, and you get blood on your clothes, doesn't have this law of kibus. So here comes Rav Papa's big diuk, as we say, his big inference. It says, min ha-keren, if it comes from the keren. What does that imply? Well, min ha-ro'oi le-keren, if it hasn't yet gone on the keren, and it's supposed to go on the keren, Then, which is exactly our 3 matanot, right? All 4 really, but obviously the first one's going to need kibus. So even the other 3 need kibus. That's what he says. And that's Rav Papa's proof. How do I know the 3 need kibus? From there. Comes the Gemara, the stam of the Gemara, right? We don't have an author here, but says something you're saying doesn't make sense though, because if you say, this is sort of a 2-pronged question, and I want to set that up because otherwise it's going to get a little confusing where we're going forward. What they say is, I'm going back to yesterday's daf, vilit amech, according to what you said, if you're going to say min hakeren doesn't need kibus, but what's supposed to go on the keren needs kibus, then look at the next words in the Braita. I'm sorry, in the Mishna. The Mishna says, min ha-yisod also doesn't need kibus. Now, what goes on the yisod? The shirayim, the remainders. So, min ha-yisod doesn't need kibus, but it would sound like min ha-ra'oi yisod, the blood that's going to be poured on the altar, that remainder, needs kibus. Now, generally, if I asked you, would you need kibus from that? You would say no, because we already learned the shirayim are not a critical element of the sacrifice. Everything's done when we're done with zrika. Okay? It's not a critical element. Now, so there's 2 problems here with what they're saying. Number 1, there's no logic to Rav Papa at this point. And the way Rav Papa reads that Mishnah is problematic. It's problematic because Rav Papa's only saying the 3 matanot, right? You're waiting to do the 3 matanot. You have the blood in the vessel and it splatters on you. You have to do kibus. But he wouldn't say, according to what he's saying, it's only because they're treated like the blood. But he wouldn't say that about the shirayim when you're done with the 3 matanot, and really the 4 at this point. You did all 4, and now you're waiting to just pour the remainder in the base of the altar. He's not going to think that you need kibus then. And that's, if he infers from min ha-keren that it's not min ha-ra'oi keren, then min ha-yisod from the base, remember, the Mishna is talking about what doesn't need kibus. So if you're going to infer then what is ready to go on the base, would need kibus, well, that's not what Rav Papa is saying. So your inference is problematic because you can't take that inference to the second part. But that's not yet where the Gemara is going with it. That we're going to come back to at the very end of this sugya and grapple with that. But what they're really grappling with is once you make that inference, min ha-keren excludes min ha-ra'oi keren, and min ha-yisod then would have to exclude min ha-ra'oi yisod. What the Gemara is saying is, if you think that whatever's supposed to go on the yisod needs kibus, if it gets on you at that stage, that is shitat Rabbi Nechemia, which we're going to try to prove. After a very long line of arguing, just want to tell you where we're going today, we're not going to be able to prove that that's what Rabbi Nechemia holds. And therefore, we're not going to be able to reject this answer of Rav Papa because it's Rabbi Nechemia. So first, let's just understand if we say it's Rabbi Nechemia, why is that rejecting Rav Papa? Because if we say that Mishnah that he's quoting on Tzadi Gimel is Rabbi Nechemia's position, who takes a very strict position on the shirayim or views them as very important, as opposed to the rabbis who don't view them as very important, right? Because they're not a critical element. If we take Rabbi Nechemia, we say this is Rabbi Nechemia's position, well then Rav Papa can't prove anything from that because that's an outlier position. That's not the mainstream opinion. Nobody goes by Rabbi Nechemia. We don't hold by him. So that would completely reject Rav Papa's proof. In the end, we're not going to reject Rav Papa's proof for that reason, but we are going to have to go back and deal with the first thing I mentioned, which is just in general his inference doesn't work, because if his inference on the word min ha-keren would lead to min ha-yisod also would say whatever min ha-ra'oi yisod is going to have to be also kibus. Well, that doesn't fit with him either. So we'll get back to that, okay? But that's why I want to explain. It's very confusing here, and the truth is I should say already, we're going with Rashi's interpretation. There's others who interpret the sugya differently because it is very confusing, okay? Often when it's confusing, it's because there's something not so clear here. So there's really, even though it doesn't look like a 2-pronged question, it really is kind of a 2-pronged question, and we'll get back to the problem with the inference part. The inference doesn't make sense at all according to Rav Papa, but right now we're trying to figure out, is this Rabbi Nechemia? So what do we know about Rabbi Nechemia? So the Gemara told us yesterday what we know about Rabbi Nechemia, which is, there's a Mishna that says, Rabbi Nechemia holds, Sheyarei Hadam, I'm at the very bottom of Lamed Chet Lamed Bet, Shekrivan Bachutz Chayav. If you put them, the shirayim, what's left for the shirayim, you're supposed to dump them on the altar, and instead of putting them at the bottom of the base of the altar, pouring them there, you take them outside and you put them on a mizbeach outside the temple, you're liable. Now, the rabbis don't think you're liable. Why not? Because they don't view it as a critical element of the process, and therefore you're not liable if you put it on the altar outside. But Rabbi Nechemia holds it is. So we're going to assume now, what the Gemara is saying is, if there's this position in this bright, if we take Rav Papa's inference seriously, that min ha-keren and min ha-yesod comes to exclude whatever is standing to be put on the keren and put on the yesod, which is the 3 matanot and the blood that's going to be poured on the yesod, needs kibus, needs laundering, then what? If we say that must hold by some extreme position, like Rabbi Nechemia, who in general treats the blood that's going on the yesod, the shirayim, these remainders, as significant. Okay, gefet, which went up in Hebrew yesterday, hopefully it'll be translated into English, but right now it's in Hebrew on the site for those who want to listen. Rabbi Nechemia sets up this very interesting, if you think about it from a machshavti perspective, from the thought, what's going on here? It's this way of treating remainders, right? How seriously do we view remainders of sanctified items? Do we say, oh, it's just a leftover and we have to just get rid of them, so we'll get rid of them by pouring them in the base of the altar? Or do they have real significance because they're remainders of sanctified items, right? Do we view them as just remainders, or do we view them as remainders, right? They're serious. It's remainder of serious items, sanctified items. We can't just treat it, right? So the level of how we treat this is really at the root of the machloka between Rabbi Nechemia and the rabbis. So Rabbi Nechemia says, you offer it outside, you're liable. Therefore, we assume he must be the one who requires kibus, because he's got the more extreme position on it where he takes them very seriously. Okay? That's what we're saying. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Just because he says if you offer them on the altar outside, does that necessarily mean that you're going to say it needs kibus? Those are two different things. Just because he says one doesn't mean he says the other, to which the Gemara answered, and that's where we ended yesterday. Yes, he does. Okay? Very simply, he requires both. Now, remember, the only thing we have in Rabbi Nechemia's name is what he says about offering them outside. So now we have to go search for where's the Gemara going to claim that Rabbi Nechemia says both. So for that, we're going to start our daf with the words v'hatanya. It says in a braita. Hatanya often is, but it says in a braita as a question, but sometimes it comes as a proof, and that's what they're saying. This is supporting our answer, yes, he does hold both. Okay, but remember, I told you in there we're not going to be able to prove this, okay, just so you know where we're going. In the end, there's no way to prove what Rabbi Nechemia holds about kibus, for the blood that's going to be the shirayim, that remainder that's going to be poured on the base of the altar. In the end, we're not going to be able to prove it, but we're going to try. So, v'hatanya, again, remember where we're going. If we can prove that it's Rabbi Nechemia, then we prove that Mishna we quoted in Sadia Gimel about Nitaz min Azara labeged and min ha-keren and min ha-yesod and the whole inference of Rav Papa, and we say, well, that only fits according to Rabbi Nechemia, then we've rejected Rav Papa's proof. So, v'hatanya, here goes our braita. Damim hatu'unim yesod. Okay, this is going to be very clear. Now, first of all, I want you to know it doesn't say Rabbi Nechemia anywhere here. We're going to have to prove this is Rabbi Nechemia's position, but that's not going to be too difficult. Okay, we have an unauthored braita, which we're going to then say obvious author is Rabbi Nechemia, and it'll be obvious because one line it says here. Remember what we do know Rabbi Nechemia says. What we definitely know Rabbi Nechemia says is if you take the blood that's supposed to be poured on the base of the altar and you bring it on an altar outside, you're liable, and the rabbis see you're exempt. So that's going to be the proof here, that it's Rabbi Nechemia. But we'll get there only at the last line of here. That's why I want to start with that, so you know. Damim hatu'unim yesod, which sounds very literally like the blood that's supposed to go on the base of the altar, which is the shirayim, the remainders that we're talking about. Ti'unim kibus. What does it say here? Exactly what we've been looking for. It needs kibus. Now, if we could prove, right, we show this is Rabbi Nechemia, then we have our answer. Rabbi Nechemia is the one who holds that it needs kibus. And then, again, the Mishna that Rav Papa quoted as his proof is an outlier position and can't be used to prove anything. Let's just keep going in the Braita, because we don't yet know this is Rabbi Nechemia. Machshava mo'ela b'hem. If you have a pigul thought, this is very radical. If you have a pigul thought with the blood that's supposed to go on the base of the altar, it's effective. Okay? It doesn't say pigul here, but that's what they mean. Machshava mo'elet. Mo'elet is effective. Your thought, your improper thought, like a pigul thought, is actually effective at this stage. Now, that's very radical because all along we've been talking about pigul. What did we say? Pigul goes from, right, shchita, you have a thought, kabbalah, holacha, right, the accepting the blood, walking the blood to the altar, and zrika, putting the blood on the altar. But not the shirayim, that's later, right? That's a very radical position, that it would be pigul there. And that's the one that says this is Rabbi Nechemia, because if you take it and offer it outside on an altar outside the temple, you'll be liable. Now, before we get to, okay, so this is clearly Rabbi Nechemia, we're continuing in the Breita. The Breita contrasts two completely opposite things. It talks about the damim that need to be put on the base of the altar, and then it talks about the damim hanishbachim la'ama. And here the laws are completely the opposite. The blood, though, that spills into that channel that they created on the floor of the temple to catch all the blood, right? It was this, like, what do you call it? Like a, I can't think of the word, but, it was like dug up a little, a channel. It's really just a channel. They created a channel in the floor so that all the extra blood that gets spilled, right? The blood that we don't want anymore, like the blood that comes out of the neck of the animal that isn't sanctified, all that blood gets channeled out into Nachal Kidron. It goes outside the temple to Nachal Kidron and the Kidron River. And these bloods, a drain, it's like a drain, thank you. I was thinking of a different word, but like a ditch, like a something. Okay, anyway, I think you get the idea. A gutter, that's a good word, thank you. Damim hanishbachim la'ama ein ti'unim kibus ve'em machshava mo'ela ben v'alemehem b'chutz patur. Okay, they don't need kibus if this blood gets on your clothes. Ein machshava. This, by the way, answers the question people asked about with the blood and the kohanim up to their knees in blood, right? If it would get on their clothes, this doesn't need kibus, by the way. Ein machshava mo'ela b'hem. If you have a pigul thought about that, okay, obviously it's irrelevant. And ma'alemehem b'chutz patur. If you were to take them and put them on an altar outside, now, don't go doing that. But if you would, you wouldn't be chayav because they're not something that's supposed to go up on the altar. I mean, now it's true, we did on Pesach, they were supposed to go on the altar, and there's a whole other thing, but that's a kind of exception. Okay, so anyway, now they say, Man Shamalei. How do we know the author of this Breita? And it's once we can prove the author of this Breita is Rabbi Nechemia, then we know what Rabbi Nechemia holds about kibus, and we're good, right? And that will reject Rav Papa's proof from that Mishna, because we're going to say that Mishna follows Rabbi Nechemia. Now, Man Shamalei, I already told you this, but now the Gemara is going to say it. Man shamat le'damar ma'alemehem b'chutz chayav Rabbi Nechemia v'ka'amar ta'un kibus. Okay, very simply, the author of this Breita must be Rabbi Nechemia because he's the only one who says that if you take the blood that's supposed to go on the base of the altar, and right again, that's just the remainders, the shirayim, and you put them on an altar outside, you're liable. He's the only one who holds that, and the same person obviously then says it needs kibus because that's what it says in this Breita. And then we basically prove that Rabbi Nechemia does hold kibus. And as we said, he only holds you offer it outside. Who's to say he says the same thing about kibus? And in fact, he does say the same thing about kibus, and we prove him that. However, you already know that I told you we're not going to prove that in the end, because now we have a problem with this Breita, though. We discussed 3 things in this Breita, okay? 2 right now fit very well with Rabbi Nechemia. But 1 doesn't make sense at all, and that's the pigul one. V'hatanya Yatzu shirayim v'haktarat imurim she'em makvin et hakapara she'em machshava mo'ela b'hem. But there's a Breita that says shirayim and the burning of the parts of the body on the altar, the parts that get burned, don't affect atonement, right? They don't prevent, if you didn't do them, you're still going to get atonement from that sacrifice. And therefore, these are exceptions to the rule or exceptions to other things in the temple. That aim machshava mo'ela b'hem. There's no me'ila in these cases. Okay? Those are parts that are not critical, and there's no me'ila. So it can't possibly be. Nobody thinks that there's me'ila in the shirayim. Even if you say it needs kibus, and even if you say if you offer on an altar outside, like Rabbi Nechemia, nobody thinks there's pigul. Like I said before, where do we have it? Pigul ends at zrika. Not the shirayim, definitely not. Because remember, what does shirayim have to, what does pigul need? It needs to be done during one of the actions that's a matir, that permits something else. The shirayim doesn't permit anything. It doesn't release some prohibition on something, like the meat to be eaten or the meat to be burned on the altar. It doesn't do anything. So, I mean, it's just something you need to do, but it's not a matir. So there's no pigul according to anybody. So now we're stuck. That Breita makes no sense. So what we're going to have to do is say that the Breita is not what it appears to be. It said tu'unim yesod. Tu'unim yesod doesn't really mean tu'unim yesod. In which case, what? This has nothing to do with the shirayim. In which case, This is not proving anything about Rabbi Nechemia. And that's really where we're going to go. But we're going to have two stages of it, because we're going to try to say it means something else. And then we're going to have to adapt that and say it actually means something else. Okay, we're going to try one. It's not going to work. And as we're going to substitute, instead of the word damim matunim yesod, we're going to say it's something else. And again, we're going to do that twice. First, we're going to say it's the shalosh matanot of the chatat, these 3 matanot that we've been talking about. That's not going to work. And then they're going to say something else. And then, where are we going to be at the end of all that? It's the end of the question we ended with yesterday's daf we're going to go back to, which is, just because Rabbi Nechemia said, doesn't mean that he holds that it needs kibus, in which case, by trying to reject Rav Papa on account of the fact that he brought this Mishna to prove, and the Mishna is just Rabbi Nechemia, we're not going to be able to prove the Mishna is Rabbi Nechemia, because we're not going to be able to prove what Rabbi Nechemia holds about kibus. So it's not going to help. Okay, so it's not going to help reject Rav Papa. In the end, we still have another problem with Rav Papa, which we'll have to deal with. But that's what we're trying to do right now. So now goes our substitution. When it says damim matunim yesod, what it really means is the blood, not really right? It does need yesod, those 3 matanot, but it also needs 3 placings on the altar still. So the Gemara obviously asked the obvious question. Yachi tunim yesod, the keren azli. These aren't tunim yesod, they're tunim keren, right? They need to be put on the corners of the altar, also on the yesod, but we should call them by their proper name. They're damim hatunim keren. So they say ema nit anim yesod. Okay, this is a partial solution. It says, well, they're needed to go on the altar, on the base of the altar, meaning down the road they'll also need to go on the base of the altar. In other words, let's just say it this way: the set of 3 matanot, right? If it fits into 2 sets. The case of 3 matanot is also tunim keren. It's also tunim yesod, right? It needs both, because first you're going to put them on the keren, then you're going to put them on the yesod. So if we change it to nit anim, it's more of a passive word. It also needs that. Sort of, that's how they explain it. In the end, we're going to reject this anyway, but it's an attempt. But now we have a bigger problem. Forget the wording, okay? Let's say we could get around the wording, and that even though it says tunim yesod, it really means the 3 matanot that are supposed to go on the corners of the altar. But machshava mo'elet behen, we know there's no pigul, remember? And remember what Rav Papa said yesterday? Ha'amar lo sharya v'lo mafagla v'lo ayla legavai kisofan. Remember, Rav Papa said there's certain ways that they're like later bloods, right? Not the earlier blood like the 1 matana, but the way they're like other bloods of the, right? He says lo sharya, they don't permit anything. That's what we said. It's not a matir. And lo mefagla, it doesn't create a pigul situation. There is no pigul thought that you could do then that will make the korban pigul. It's not. You could have a pigul thought, but it's irrelevant. It doesn't do anything. And lo ayla legavai, that's totally irrelevant one for our purposes right now, but that's if you bring them into the after the first blood placement is done, and then you bring the blood into the inner altar, you don't actually disqualify the korban, and you don't have to burn the blood like you would for the first one. But anyway, the point is, there's no pigul in this, and everyone agrees with that. So, can't be that. So let's substitute something else. Ella. Now, we are going to do tamim atunim yesod. It is the blood, the shirayim, but kitanya hi bedamim apnimiyim. It's not the shirayim of the regular offerings and the sin offering that goes outside on the outer altar. It's actually, we're going to have a stricter law for the shirayim, the remainder of the blood of the bloods that go on the inner altar. What are those? Remember, spend the next few days on them, so let's go through them. The par Yom Kippurim of the Kohen Gadol and the Seir, both the bloods go in the inner Hechal. They also go in the Kodesh Kodeshim. And they go on the altar there. We also, if you remember, and we'll get back to this, it goes on, you do 4 placements on the inner altar, and you do sprinklings. That's the Achad, Achavi Achad, Achavishtaim that we talk about. You do sprinklings. There's a bunch of different sprinklings that go on, okay? So there's sprinklings of blood in the Kodesh Kodeshim, on the Kaporet, and there's other ones, okay? So that's those. There's the Paralim Davar Tzibor. That's the communal sin offering. There's the Par Kohen HaMashiach, when the Kohen Gadol makes an erroneous ruling and then follows his own erroneous ruling. The communal sin offering is when the Beit Din makes an erroneous ruling and the majority of the people follow that ruling. Okay, all those, there's all sorts of, right, those are the main ones that go in the inner altar. So those, we're going to have a stricter rule about the shirayim, and this is going to be the law for the shirayim, what we just said. Now, Once we do that, again, and this is actually going to be the conclusion, even though we're going to ask some question about this, but again, what have we done? We said this is talking about the inner altar. Now, we're not talking about the inner altar here. Our whole thing is all about the outer altar, right? The bloods that go on the outer altar, the chatat, that was the whole first part of the Mishna about the blood on the outer altar. And what we're going to say is, right, the 3 placements of the outer altar need kibus, right? The shirayim doesn't need kibus. And again, that even Rabbi Nechemia, now the problem is what? This source that we tried to use to prove, we don't know what Rabbi Nechemia says about these shirayim. But if we want to prove it from this source, we can't prove it from this source because this source is talking about the pnimiyim and not the chitzonim. So it's not relevant to prove anything about Rabbi Nechemia. So we're left with, if you wanted, Rav Papa wanted to prove from this Mishna, and we tried to say, you can't prove it from the Mishna, again, the one about from the neck, from the keren, from the yesod doesn't need kibus, but it would infer that before that it would, and you wanted to say, oh, that's Rabbi Nechemia. We don't know what Rabbi Nechemia says about kibus for the outer altar ones, because that's not what this braita is talking about. So now the Gemara says, wait, if you're trying to say that this braita that we quoted, again, there's a few different sources we saw, the braita at the very top of Lamed Tet Amud Aleph, which is damim atunim yesod tunim kibus, and there's pigul, and there's, you offer it outside your chayav. If you want to say, that's not Rabbi Nechemia, right? Because it's talking about the damim hapnimim, and maybe everyone agrees about that. Aval b'damim achitzonim patur. Wait, so then you're going to say that you'd be exempt, right, from kibus, right, there would be no pigul, and ma'aleh mehem b'chutz, you'd be exempt. Hamane Rabbi Nechemia. Well, then you'd have to say this. Now, how could it be that all these are exempt? You would say this is Rabbi Nechemia. Da'amal shirei adam shekrivam b'chutz chayav. Sorry. 1 second. Oh, I skipped a line. That's why I knew something wasn't making sense. Sorry. Okay, let's go back. I got very confused because I misplaced. Okay, so now we're up to Kitanya Yibadamim Pnimim. Aval b'damim achitzoniyim mai. So what would you say then? Damim achitzoniyim what? Patur. You would say then it's exempt, right? Because our whole point is this is about the bloods that are gone on the inner altar, not the bloods that are going on the outer altar. But then wait a minute. If the damim, now there's no problem with saying it's patur, but if really it's going to be patur, what should it say in the braita? The braita, if you remember, contrasted 2 things. What did it contrast? The damim hatunim yesod, which now we're translating as in the chataot hapnimiyot, the ones that go on the inner altar, and then we're contrasting it to the blood that's in that gutter on the floor of the temple, the amah. But what should it, if we're going to say that this is only true for the blood on the inner altar, but it's not true for the blood on the outer altar, then wouldn't you think it should contrast it to the blood on the outer altar and say, this is the law for the blood on the inner altar that's waiting to be, the remainders of it, that's supposed to, I just want to remind you, yes, the bloods go on the inner altar, but the remainder always goes on the base of the outer altar, okay? Not that that's relevant to here, but just so you know the facts, right? You put the bloods on the inner altar and you do the sprinklings and all the placements and everything, right? The 7 sprinklings, you do the 4 placements. But then you take the rest of the blood out and you put it on the outer altar, on the base. That's what we're talking about here. If the laws there are different than the shirayim and the remainders of the blood from the outer altar, okay, let's read it inside. Now, if there was no comparison in the braita, that would be fine. But they compare it to another type of blood, which is the blood in the gutter. But it should have differentiated there and said, it should have said what is exactly the way we're reading it. It should have said it explicitly. It should have said, well, this is only true when we're talking about the remainder that has these strict laws. We're only talking about the damim on the inner altar. But the blood that comes from the outer altar, the remainders of that blood, is exempt. Shouldn't we have said that, right? In other words, if we're setting up that this is only some of the blood and not all the blood, and the Braita already compared it to cases where the law is different, well, we should have compared it then to the laws of the blood from the outer altar. And it should have said, this is only the blood that goes on the inner altar, the remainders of that blood, but the remainders of the blood from the outer altar, no. Okay, so why didn't it do that? So the Gemara is going to have an answer for this, because again, we want to really keep it that it really is the inner altar, and this is a pretty good question, right? It's pretty obvious you should have said that. So the Gemara, to answer this question, says, well, Hamani Rabbi Nechemia. This Braita must be Rabbi Nechemia, the same Rabbi Nechemia before, but not, before the whole question was, is the Mishna Rabbi Nechemia? That, it's not. Okay, and that kind of gets rid of our difficulty with Rav Papa. But this Braita is Rabbi Nechemia. Why does that make a difference? You'll see in a minute. Okay, now remember, what does Rabbi Nechemia hold? Not only the shirayim that go on the inner altar, if you offer them on an altar outside, you'll be liable, but also the blood that goes on the outer altar. If you offer them outside, you'll be right. The remainder of the blood from the outer altar, if you offer them outside, you'll be obligated. That was the whole machloka between him and the rabbis, which means that what? Okay, so now I set this up before so you'd understand it. The Braita compares two things that are completely opposites, right? Whatever was true for the blood that was tu'unim yesod, which now we're claiming is the shirayim of the inner ones, is completely the opposite halacha of the ones that are going in this gutter, that fell into the gutter or went into the gutter. But if we say that this Braita is Rabbi Nechemia, and it's comparing those two things that are complete opposites, that's why it doesn't compare the chatat chitzoni. The blood, the shirayim of the blood, the remainder of the blood that comes from the outer offerings is similar in one way. Because what way is it similar? If you offer them outside, you'll also be chayav. So it's similar to the chatat pnimi in one way, different from it in two ways. So why is that relevant? You still could have compared it. Well, they say the following. In other words, if you had done that, you wouldn't have then three situations that are completely opposite each other. What they want to say is like this. When you have Tanaitic sources, remember they were used as mnemonic devices. And the best way to remember things is to remember things that are completely opposite each other. So the Braita was organized in a way that it shows things that are completely opposite, okay? Like the first, kibus, no. Machshava mefagelet, kibus, yes. Machshava mefagelet, yes. Maleh b'chutz chayav, yes. Okay? Ama, no. Okay? B'chutz, if you would compare it to the chatat chitzoniot, you would have kibus, no. Machshava mefagelet, no. But you would have yes for maleh mehem b'chutz. Again, this is all assuming you're holding Rabbi Nechemia's position. But that's the way they answer it. They say maybe the Braita, or to get rid of this question against it, the Braita must be Rabbi Nechemia. It's not different in all three ways, and therefore preferred to have a foil that was completely different. So now we've succeeded in saying this Braita doesn't prove anything about the chatat chitzoni, because it's not talking about that, which was our topic. We don't know if Rabbi Nechemia requires kibus on the remainders of the blood that's gone on the outside altar, which means that what we tried to reject Rav Papa and saying, you can't say that Mishna is your proof because that Mishna goes like, right, Rabbi Nechemia, because again, min ha-yesod would have to be, min ha-re'oi li-yesod would need kibus, and then that would be Rabbi Nechemia, but we don't really know that Rabbi Nechemia holds that. So we can't say that. However, we're still stuck. Why are we stuck? Because the inference is problematic. If you say, Rav Papa's whole proof was, the inference was, if it's from the keren, you don't need kibus. But if it's supposed to still go on the keren, those three matanot, it needs kibus. But how do you deal with the inference from the next words? Min ha-yesod would then imply, but if it's supposed to go on the yesod, it needs kibus. Now, at first, they tried to say it's Rabbi Nechemia and right? There is an opinion that says that, but we don't actually know there's an opinion that says that, so we can't say that. So now, just that Mishnah makes no sense according to Rav Papa's inference. That's, if you just say there is no inference, then you're in better shape. But he said there was an inference, and that was his whole proof. So Ravina is going to now figure this out. Ravina Amar. So that's why I said it's a two-pronged question. The first difficulty with Rav Papa we dealt with, which is it's not Rabbi Nechemia, because we can't prove it's Rabbi Nechemia, because we don't know what he says about kibus. We only know what he says about bringing it on an outside altar. So now we say the following. Ravina says, Mina keren mamash. Okay, Mina keren, we're going to go with the way Rav Papa says it. It's really Mina keren. And therefore, anything before that supposed to go on the keren, like the three matanot, you'll have to do kibus. But min ha-yesod means min ha-ra'oi li-yesod. It doesn't exclude min ha-ra'oi. It actually includes. Min ha-yesod means from the base, and anything that's supposed to go on the base of the altar doesn't need kibus. So we're saying min in one case means to exclude min ha-ra'oi, and min in the other case includes min ha-ra'oi. So Amalei Rav Tachlif Harbagaza Ravina, he says that's a little weak. One, it's the same wording. You're going to say one comes to include and one exclude. Why don't you just say Idi v'idi ra'oyu? Maybe you'd say against Rav Papa that min hakeren and min hayesod includes min hara'oy, meaning not the blood that's going to be sprinkled on the altar, meaning the 3 matanot, because the 1, yes, obviously, but not the 3. And not the blood that's going to be sprinkled on the yesod, or got on the yesod, or got on the keren. Maybe it means that. Now we go against Rav Papa. So he says, Hi, Mai, why would you say that? Hashta ra'oy l'keren amart. It makes no sense to say that, because if you say the 3 matanot don't need kibus, right, when it's standing to go on the altar, you don't need ra'oy l'yesod mebai. You wouldn't need to go on and say the blood that's going to go on the base, because obviously if the blood at an earlier stage is not going to create a chiyuv of kibus, of laundering, then obviously at a later stage, when you already did the 3 placements, of course, it's not going to create a problem. So that would be completely unnecessary. And that's why in the end, Ella, he concludes with mina kerem mamash, mina yisod, mina ra'oy yisod. And the inference on mina kerem is different than the inference on mina yisod. Mina yisod actually includes mina ra'oy yisod. And mina kerem says only from the keren and not what's supposed to go on the keren. And from that, we actually resolve Rav Papa's proof. So it took a long time. It was quite complicated. And the next daf is pretty smooth and quick, and you'll see Amud Bet's really short, so don't worry that we're still at the end of Amud Aleph. Okay. What we now want to do, although we're going to get off on lots of other things that are going to lead us into the next few dapim of learning, is this halacha at the end of the Mishnah. And from there, we're going to get all into these chataot pnimiyot that we've been mentioning, but now we're going to really talk about them. Like I said, I listed them before. These are the chataot, the sin offerings that get brought. The blood goes on the inner altar. They have different laws, different things, and we're now, the Mishna points out that all the placings of the blood are critical. So now we want to know what's the source. Tanu Rabbanan, here we quote a Braita, and we're going to do a very long Braita today, okay? In fact, the Braita ends almost at the very end of our daf, okay? Now, which maybe is why the daf is pretty simple, because it's just a Braita. We're going to darshan one pasuk, okay? Here's our pasuk. Now, you might remember this from Horayot, if you learned Horayot, but we're really going to get into this pasuk. So if you remember Horayot, it starts off with the sin offering the Kohen Gadol brings. That's what we said. If he mistakenly teaches a ruling and then teaches something wrong and then goes with his ruling, he has a specific sin offering. The next section is the Parhilim Davar Shel Tzibor, which is the communal bull offering, which is if the community follows a mistaken, erroneous ruling of the court. So those two are chataot pnimiyot with a bull. So it says in the second one, the communal offering, Va'asa lapar, I'm going to read the whole pasuk, it's Vayikra chapter 4, verse 20. Va'asa lapar, we do to that bull, kasher asa lapar chatat. The rules of this par are like the rules of the one we mentioned previously, of the par Kohen HaMashiach, the one that was in the section above it. Ken yaselo, this should be done, like this, it should be done for him. Okay, that's completely, we have asa kasher asa, there's already double language. We have Ken yaselo, which is another extra word, okay? And the real extra word that's going to really struggle, and we're going to struggle with this for the next few dapim, is the word lipal. Why say do to the bull as you did to the other bull? Say do to it. We know we're talking about the bull. That's the whole topic here. So why do we say do to the bull? That bull word is going to really bother everybody. But that's not what's our main drasha for today, or for the beginning, why we brought this. Tanu Rabbanan, v'asa kasher asa. Matamud lomar. Why do you have to say asa and asa twice? Lichpol b'haza'ato. It's to double language teaches you have to do it. What do you have to do? The sprinkling. In a minute, we're going to say why specifically the sprinkling. Okay? There it says you have to sprinkle 7 times, and then you have to put it on the 4 kranot of the altar. So it wants to tell you have to do that. That's why it says asa kasher asa. Double language. So now they say, well, which matanot are we talking about? Because there's the 7 and there's the 4. So they say, if it's going to be one or the other, we're assuming you're talking about the 7. Why the 7? We're only going to understand this at the beginning of tomorrow's daf, which is there's other places where the 7 we know have to happen. And therefore, if it's going to be one or the other, we're going to say it's the 7. Now that wasn't what we're looking for yet. Matan arba minayin. How do you know? And here's the source of what we're looking for. That's our Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about this 4 placements have to happen. They're critical element of the korban. Talmud Lomar, Ken Ya'aseh, the double language, Ken Ya'aseh. Okay, the fact that they repeat, right? First there's a double language, Asa Kasher Asa. Then they again say, Ken Ya'aseh Lo, this is what you should do to the bull. Well, that must include something else. That's the Matan Arba. So we could have ended here. Okay? And that's where Amud Aleph ends. But, well, almost. Now we get to this big line. Lipal. Okay, now we're off on a tangent because we brought this Breita for what we wanted it for, but we're bringing the Breita. We're not really off on a tangent. We're quoting the whole Breita. Now, why does it say the word Lipar? I told you this is going to bother everybody. Now, we assume what's the bull? The bull, the Paralim Dever Shel Tzibur, the bull that you're bringing for the communal sin offering. That was the topic of the thing. On the other hand, what's the problem? We already know we're talking about the bull. Why did you say the bull? You must be talking about some other bull. And they completely bring in something from totally different section and say, Lepar Zepar Yom Kippurim. What we want you to know here is this bull is actually the bull that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur, which has nothing to do with this section. Right? That's in Vayikra Tet Zayim. We're in Vayikra chapter 4. And what it's doing is, now we don't know for what yet, we're going to get into that in the next few dapim, but it's comparing the laws of Yom Kippur, the par, the bull, the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur to atone for his own sins, is compared to the second par in the pasuk. Aseh lapal, kasher asa lapar chatat. What's the par chatat? The second par, this is the par, okay, we're going to read right now. Kasher asa lapal, top of Amud Bet, ze par Kohen Mashiach. Okay, what we want to do here in the pasuk is we want to compare, even though we're in the communal sin offering, but we're saying in the middle of the communal sin offering, we say, do to the bull on Yom Kippur like you did to the bull, like the same way we do the same actions, which we don't yet know which they are, but we're going to learn the actions from the bull of the Kohen Gadol that he brings for his own sin offering. That's going to be also what we're going to do with the bull of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, his special sacrifice he brings. Ha-chatat. These are, like we learn from a hekesh, it's what we call a juxtaposition. Now we put the par and the par in the same pasuk. Again, the topic is communal sin offering, but we're actually comparing two completely different things. The par Kohen Gadol and the par Kohen HaMashiach, right? Then one is the par Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur, not to be confused with the sin offering that the Kohen Gadol brings if he makes a mistake. Ha-chatat. Why is it called the par ha-chatat? We know which par they're talking about, so what's ha-chatat? What does that help us? Right? All of the parim are chatat. Elu sirei avodah zarah. Now we're making another comparison in this pasuk, and from here we're going to learn from, now what's sirei avodah zarah? You might remember this from Horayot. There's a section in Bamidbar, chapter 15, which talks about the community makes a mistake and does all the mitzvot, right? One of all the mitzvot, and then they say, what is that? Must be, it didn't say it explicitly, but it must be they worship Avodah Zarah. And there's different korbanot, it's a seir specifically. And that's what this is referring to, okay? Now, what's interesting, and we'll see this later, but the details by the seir are very missing. Like there's almost no details about the sacrifices there. Like how you do the sacrifices, what animal you bring, but not much more than that. Whereas in the Par Kohen HaMashiach, there's the most detail. In the Paralim Dever Shel Tzibur, there's detail a little less. We're going to compare all this as we go on. And what the Gemara is really attempting to do here is figuring out what we can learn from what. So that's why it's bringing all these things in the pasuk. Also the Par Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur is missing details. So this is why I told you, in Zevachim in general, not every korban, even though you look at Vayikra, and if I'd ask you, you'd say it's so detail-oriented. But actually tons of details are missing. And they're always trying to learn from others. So this drasha is really just putting them all in the same pasuk to learn all sorts of details one from the other, which we don't yet know what details they're learning. That's going to come clear in the next few dapim. So the Breita continues. Maybe I'll include Sirei Regalim and Sirei Rashi Chodeshim, right? It's Rosh Chodesh today. On Rosh Chodesh, the special series in Mechad L'Chatat. And also on the Regalim we bring. What are they for? That brings us back to Shvuot. Remember, we had a whole discussion, what are they for? And really they're for accidents people made about impurity in the temple and impurity with sacrificial items that they don't even know they made. So we bring these every month and every holiday to atone for these things we don't even know we did. So maybe those would also be compared. No, because Talmud Lomar lo. Remember, it said Ken Yaseh lo. Lo means for it, not for anything else. So on the one hand, there were all these, we're going to include all sorts of things, and then we're going to exclude, though, from the word lo. So the obvious question, the Breita asks, why those included and those not included? We could have swapped it and said, Sirei Regalim and Rosh Chodesh is included, and Yom Kippur is not, or something like that. So, right, we do have this including and then limitation in the pasuk. If we're going to have to choose, I'd rather choose the one that you know you sinned, you know you made a mistake, and you know what you made a mistake about. Whereas the ones for the other, right? People didn't even know they did it. It's atoning for things that it's not even clear anyone did anything, and if they did, we don't even know about it. So that's the one that's going to be excluded. V'chiper. Now we're just continuing to darshan this pasuk. The pasuk ends with the words V'chiper alehem hakohen. The kohen atones by doing the sacrifice for the people. V'nislach lehem, and they are forgiven. This is again for the communal sin offering. Kiper afal pi shelo samach. You're going to get atonement even if you didn't do smicha, which is putting your hands on the korban. V'nislach, and you'll be forgiven. Afal pi shelo natan shirayim. We're back to the shirayim. Shirayim are not a critical element. You'll get forgiven even if you didn't pour the remainder of the blood on the altar. So, question again. So why did you say, actually, I said the Braita goes till almost the end of the daf. It actually goes till the end of the daf. Why did you say that we're going to disqualify and say, now remember, this takes us back to the beginning. What's critical? The sprinklings. What's not critical? Smicha and hazaot. Why not? Why those yes, those no? Again, seems arbitrary. Amarta, last line for today, posel bahazaot, shemagvot b'kol makom. We go back to that line we saw, which is hazaot are magvot in other places, which only we'll see tomorrow what they are. The Braita doesn't tell us. The Gemara is going to have to say, what are they? And machshirani b'smicha v'shirayim she'en magvot b'kol makom. We know that smicha and shirayim are not critical elements, okay? And therefore, okay, by the way, remember, Rabbi Nechemia maybe did think they were. That was the whole way we read that Braita. We said it's Rabbi Nechemia's position. That's a very strict position about the shirayim of the chataot pnimiyot. But this is according to the rabbis who don't have that strict opinion and don't think the chataot pnimiyot have a strict rule. And the chataot pnimiyot are not critical, and the smicha is not critical. We see that in other places. So therefore, if we're going to have to say something is not critical, it's going to be those. Something is critical, it's going to be those. And that's where we finish our daf. Okay? In Gefet, it's very interesting. She connects this whole two approaches about shirayim, how critical they are, how not, how we treat remainders. Also shows it from like Parshanut and the Pasuk, also in the Pasukim, which is very interesting. Anyway, it's an interesting shiur. Okay, so right now it's not up in English. We're hoping the English will come in. Usually it comes in, sometimes it doesn't. So let's hope. If not, those who Hebrew is good, you can read it, listen in Hebrew. Okay, so what did we do today? Two main things. Number one, we dealt with Rav Papa, who tried to prove this one thing out of all the 8 he listed, how the 3 matanot are like the first matana, which is critical, and they're not, but same laws for the laws of kibus, and that he proved in that Mishna. The Gemara tried to say, number one, the Mishnah is Rabbi Nechemia, can't say that, and your inference leads us to some weird inference about the Yesod, to which we resolved one by saying it's not Rabbi Nechemia, because we don't even know what Rabbi Nechemia says about it, so you can't say it's Rabbi Nechemia. We don't know what he says about kibus, even though he does treat the shirayim more seriously for taking them out of the altar, putting them in an altar outside the temple, but we don't know what he says about kibus. In the end, we really couldn't prove it. And we said the inference on Mina Ra'ui is not the same, on Mina Keren is not the same as the inference on Mina Yesod, and basically resolved that. And then we went to prove the halacha and the Mishnah that any blood that goes on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, those 4 placements have to happen. Now we learned not only the 4, also the 7. Where did we learn it? V'asa kasher asa, and then ken yaseh lo. That teaches you the first the 7, then the 4, the repetition of the word asa, asa, asa. Right? 3 times comes to teach you. First time is, okay, do it. Second time, critical for the 7, then the 4. Okay? And then we went on to this other drasha, which is going to lead us off on what are these comparisons of that somehow this pasuk makes reference to the Par Kohen Mashiach, the Seir of Azara, okay, and compares them to the Par Kohen Mashiach. And what are we using these comparisons for? We don't really know yet, but it included those. It didn't include the Seirei the Seirei Regalim and Roshei Chodashim, and we explain why. And the end of the pasuk basically tells us what elements are critical, what elements are not. Right? And the first part was what elements are critical. The Chiper and V'dislach can teach you. Well, you can get atonement and you'll be pardoned, even if you didn't do smicha and even if you didn't do the shirayim, because they're not critical elements. And again, why that is critical, why that isn't, the Gemara, the Braita explained. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Chodesh Tov and B'sorot Tovot.